he's really a prince, then I...
Exactly. You're not just Amelia Thermopolis. You are Amelia Mignonette Thermopolis Rinaldi, Princess of Genovia.
Me? A princess?
She was a princess worth waiting for.
I am the Princess of Wales. I come as the king's servant and with his authority.
To do what?
To discuss the king's proposals. Will you speak with a woman?
2026 began with a bunch of life in 2016 posts all over social media. And it got me thinking, if we jumped to 2035, the chance a domed green cake appearing somewhere in people's feeds from 10 years prior is highly likely. Well, that and matcha lattes. Hey there, my name is Sylvie and welcome back to my channel. I am a baker who has been studying the science, fundamentals and history of this industry whilst also spending many hours in the kitchen for my own website roamingtaste.com. Though I run a baking website, I've never actually tried to make princess cake because it somewhat scares me and also I more lean into approachable baking. But today we are diving into this ultra feminine dessert, the layers of what's included in it, and the link between princess cake and our current cultural trends. All about Jenny. In 1867, a Johanna, better known as Jenny Ackerstrom, is born in Loherad, Roslagen, which is located about an hour's drive north of Stockholm in Sweden. Jenny was the oldest of 3 children, all daughters, and became a governess before enrolling in the Antonium school cookery training program, which she completed in 1897. By 1903, just 6 years post-graduating the cookery training program, Jenny had become head of a number of mobile school cookery courses throughout the Stockholm area. And by 1907, Jenny founded her domestic science school for girls in Stockholm, which saw pupils from a mostly wealthier section of society studying along with all 3 daughters of Prince Carl, the Duke of Västergötland. Astrid, Margareta and Marta, the daughters of Prince Carl and Princess Ingeborg, all attended the school during the 1920s. Jenny Ackerstrom had a good head for business and understood how to utilize her royal pupils in order to bolster her business and thereby attract further pupils and students. This understanding of using her royal connections helped Jenny publish a cookbook in 1929, which Google translates to The Princess's Cookbook, Home Cooking and Holiday Food, with the 3 princesses' image on the cover and references to the favorite dish of each princess. You could say this was the height of popularity for these types of schools in Sweden, where women were taught all about domestication, which saw a decline in each decade thereafter. So Jenny really utilized her connections at this pivotal moment to grow and spread her business. Most of Jenny's background is actually taken from this Swedish female biographical lexicon website, so thank you so much for existing. Though Jenny had her school, she was also a regular contributor to various newspapers, including Bonniers Veckotidning, in which she had a recurring food column which included menus and recipes. She also wrote for 2 magazines, Veckojournalen and for Bonniers Månadstidning. It wasn't until the 1948 edition of the book that we see the first version of the originally named Gröntarta. It was so beloved by the princesses that it was renamed to Prinsesstarta, likely within the decade after it was first published, though it's a bit messier than that. According to Tasting Table, legend has it that Ackerstrom actually created 3 elaborately decorated cakes, 1 for each princess. While some say the princess cake is an amalgamation of the 3, Astrid's cake most closely resembles the modern version of the beloved confection and the 1948 Gröntarta. So much of the princess cake story is well detailed. Jenny Ackerstrom from, created it thanks to her connection to the Swedish princesses, and thanks to that connection, she published a book. But so many details are incredibly unclear. How 3 different cakes ended up becoming this beloved version, which is not exactly like any of the cakes. Why it's covered in green marzipan, how it went from being called Gröntarta or green cake to Prinsesstarta or princess cake, and the last element, which is also incredibly fascinating, how did it become popular in pockets of the United States? In my research, there was a mention in a couple of places of an Annika Larsson, who is a baker in Stockholm in the late 1940s, combining all 3 cakes into one. But I couldn't prove this, and regardless of why it's green or how princess cake came to be in its current format, it quickly became popular throughout Sweden. The popularity of princess cake in Sweden cannot be understated, as Semi-Swede states in their article, Princess Cake Demystified, Prinsesstarta, that every year around 500,000 Prinsesstartas are sold in Sweden. For a country of 10.6 million people, this is an impressive amount. However, since 2004, the 3rd week in September is officially Prinsesstarta week. For every Prinsesstarta purchased in Sweden during this period, 10 Swedish krona, $1.50, is donated to Crown Princess Victoria's fund that benefits chronically ill and disabled children and adolescents in Sweden. The actual amount donated to that charity is not reported, though the fact princess cake is the most beloved cake in Sweden and is easy to find in bakeries either as a whole cake or in slices means it's probably an incredibly easy initiative for people to support. To answer that last question, why or how did it become popular in pockets of the United States? Well, there was a real influx of Scandinavians to the United States in the early 20th century, particularly on the West Coast with the gold rush boom. But that was well before the recipe was first published. For some reason, this cake has been featured in bakeries around San Francisco for years, so clearly those immigrants bought the cake, either the recipe itself in letters or knowledge of it through generations joining family already established there. But this is all sheer speculation, as I can't really prove how it became popular in certain sections of the United States. Now we somewhat know the background. What makes a princess cake? Before we get into the layers of princess cake, it's actually helpful to know that most people in Sweden get their princess cake from bakeries. And in my research, this comment on Eat Your Books stands out. This is my absolute favourite cake to eat. Never contemplated making one from scratch, by D. Kennedy. So if you can buy the cake first, be like D. Kennedy. Go ahead. But if you want to make this cake, as per the Visit Stockholm website, princess cake is made up of 3 layers of cake overlapped with vanilla cream and raspberry jam topped with a hefty layer of whipped cream, all covered by a thin layer of emerald green marzipan, some powdered sugar, and a marzipan rose. This is much the same as found on La Pâtisserie du Monde's article on the history of princess cake. The original Prinsesstarta consisted of several layers of sponge cake filled with vanilla custard and raspberry jam. Now, I've tried to find the original recipe and it's pretty clear I don't speak Swedish, for which I truly apologize of any butchering I may have already done or that will be done in the rest of this video. So it was incredibly difficult to actually confirm this, particularly as what Jenny created and what we now have not being the same. However, there have been a few recent non-Swedish bakers sharing their versions of this cake in some larger English-speaking publications, and 2 things stood out. 1, mascarpone is absolutely not traditional for the cream layer, so if you follow one of those recipes, be aware you're not making it traditionally, but that is fine if that's your preference. Just don't tell Swedish people that. Secondly, this is thanks to the so many Swedes in the comments of a large publication's princess cake where they did use mascarpone, vehemently swearing that a true princess cake has no jam. When it does, it's a completely different cake. Even though most Swedes don't actually bother making this cake, I did some market research, you could say, with Swedish recipes recipes of princess cake to see what the most consistent ingredients and process was in making it. The research included 8 recipes and not all had ratings. This is to say, the website, whether it's popular in Sweden or not, didn't all have ratings, so I'm not completely sure that they've actually been tested out by the public. With one exception, all cakes were 3 layers. The exception actually had 4 layers, but they also changed things up by having a very thin layer of cream. 5 of the cakes had an equal portion of wheat and potato flour in the sponge cakes. By the way, the protein in wheat flour in Sweden is actually the same as all-purpose or plain flour in the United States, a standard 10 to 12%. This means if you make this cake in the United States, you'll end up with the same results as they would have in their sponge cakes in Sweden. And one cake had 1/3 cup plus 1.5 tablespoons wheat flour to 1 cup potato flour, which means 75% of the Swedish cakes in my market research used wheat and potato flour in their sponge cakes. All recipes whipped the sugar and eggs until fluffy, with a mixing time up to about 10 minutes. A couple actually whipped whilst heating the bowl until warm in a saucepan or double boiler, but all recipes added the dry ingredients thereafter and slowly incorporated. A couple of the recipes included stirring through melted butter after adding the dry ingredients, and 7 of the cakes were baked in one tin and then divided into 3 layers, or 4 in the case of that one exception. The one remaining recipe actually called for baking the cake batter spread over circles marked on parchment paper on flat baking sheets. That one recipe actually required the baked cakes then be shaped into nice uniform circles after baking. I just feel that that one is just slightly more high maintenance and unnecessary when we consider the overall average there. For the custard or pastry cream, 2 of the recipes, which by the way, these will all be linked below in the caption, used an instant custard called marchand. 5 of the recipes used milk as the dairy base, with one recipe using equal parts milk and cream, and one recipe used only cream as the dairy base. Of the 6 cakes that homemade custard for the cake, 4 relied on cornstarch and the remaining 2 relied on gelatin to help set the custard. Most of the custards were made the standard way of whisking egg yolks, sugar and starch in a bowl whilst the milk or cream, that dairy base, is heated in a saucepan over low heat, where it is then added to the egg yolks in a slow stream whilst the eggs are whisked to incorporate and heat slowly to avoid curdling. The whole mixture is then returned to the heat and whisked until thickened. Where gelatin was called for, it was bloomed the standard way in cold water whilst you make the custard, and then whisked into the thickened custard until dissolved before allowing the custard to cool completely. All the homemade custards could be made ahead as the required cooling time. 7 of the 8 cakes used raspberry jam, of which 5 were store-bought. One actually used frozen raspberries, and one included a recipe for homemade raspberry jam. Ooh, that was close. And one included a recipe for homemade raspberry jam, which is to say, it seems raspberry jam is an essential element in princess cake nowadays, even if it wasn't an original feature, particularly because all of these recipes came from Sweden. So we will just let the Swedes fight it out while we add raspberry jam. That's all I'm gonna say. All 8 cakes called for homemade whipped cream. This is because you can control the actual thickness of the whipped cream, and then it also has no other additives, with one exception. The marzipan fondant layer was store-bought in 7 of the recipes, and a full and detailed recipe was provided to home make it in the 8th recipe. That recipe is actually incredibly specific in using gel food coloring to achieve that perfect green hue. Lastly, it was a 50-50 split on making the rose garnish versus just using a store store-bought one. The reason for this research was to find out how Swedes make this cake so that if you want to or have to make it yourself, traditional details were confirmed, and then it quickly became apparent that some portions are easily outsourced and not essential to be homemade, and even the sponge cake layers in some recipes were actually calling for store-bought versions as well. There are so many components to this cake, and though some details are really consistent, such as using a combination of plain and potato flour in the sponge cakes, or making the custard by heating the dairy whilst whisking your sugar, egg yolks and starch and then heating that all together until thickened, the amount of patience and attention required to actually make and assemble the cake feels like you need to set aside time in your diary to actually attempt it, as well as creating that perfect smooth cream dome and final nice marzipan layer before adding that beautiful rose garnish. The sponge cakes are actually best made the day before assembly, and due to the fact the custard needs to be cooled before it is then added, makes it so that you can do several of the elements over a few days before your final assembly. Now that we've gone over the many layers in this cake, Eater notes in their article, the princess cake gets its princess moment because of these multiple components. Bakers, including lamb, sometimes find the princess cake intimidating. That lamb is referring to Nicola Lamb, writer of the James Beard awarded baking book Sift, and now contributor to the New York Times, where she has actually made the princess cake, albeit adding some twists, like she only has 2 layers and she used mascarpone in place of the cream dome. Just read the comments on that post on their Instagram and see how strongly Swedish people feel about that choice, is all I'm going to say. It's the one and only time I've ever seen Scandinavian people who aren't particularly well known for being super emotional really make it clear that this is a non-negotiable for them. And I actually saw a couple of comments say, I now understand how Italians feel about tiramisu. In the article, it's sexy, it's Swedish, it's everywhere. How Princess Cake Conquered America, The Guardian reflects, this is, after all, a cake so difficult to construct that it served as an early technical challenge on the Great British Bake Off. Its wrinkle-free marzipan dome is a fiendish feat of kitchen engineering. And Hannah Ziskin, the pastry chef for Quarter Sheets, who has become actually quite famous for her take on Princess Cake, notes in the same article that it's kind of more in the world of professional baking. There's something that's a little inaccessible about it. Now, I share these comments to say that even people whose job it is to bake can find Princess Cake somewhat daunting. This isn't to put you off though, and in fact, after doing all of this research for this episode, I actually feel more inclined to give this cake a go than I would have beforehand. But like any technical baking, it's important to really take your time when making this, tackle each step at a time, and you're going to end up with a great success that tastes delicious. I just know it. Dessert and culture collide. There is something about the princess cake's rise in popular culture in the United States aligning at the same time as tradwives and things ultra feminine. Even the clean girl aesthetic and princess cake all colliding in 2025 is not an accident. They play into each other. In the article, Miu Miu's Aprons Turn the Tradwife Fantasy Inside Out, Sarah Radin reflects that tradwives offer one version of control in the chaos. What they're really selling is the fantasy of simplicity. Their world is clean, color coordinated, and eerily consistent. Aesthetically pleasing, clean, perfectly sliced layers of princess cake belie how much effort is required when making it. How much work a tradwife has to put into a simple loaf of bread. How many products or even injections go into the clean girl look. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and with the shift away from the girl boss era, all things cozy, inclusive, being willing to take up space, particularly in professional spaces, to owning the place in the home and dressing up for your spouse, all colliding at the same time. This smooth, domed shaped cake topped with a single rose those filters into our social media aligns with the message that being feminine is what we should own, and the best women know their place, and some even insist that their husbands speak for them at restaurants.
So you want to become a tradwife? My theory on tradwives is that it's come out of this like post-COVID era where we saw how broke the system was, where all of the schooling and domestic load and all the BS all fell onto the woman. So insert this aesthetic that presents the idea that, hey, the system's broken, you can opt out of it entirely. You don't have to do it. It's off-grid.
Since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen women throughout the globe gain many rights, which in turn gave them a voice worth having. While in 2025, we see how a publication that considers itself a place for intelligence whilst being staffed with a niche group of people from high-income backgrounds felt comfortable enough to publish an opinion piece with this title. In the book Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women by Susan Faludi, which was published in 1991, we see a similar vibe as with the tradwife movement in the 2020s. Women are unhappy precisely because they are free. Women are enslaved by their own liberation. They have grabbed at the gold ring of independence, only to miss the one ring that really matters. They have gained control of their fertility only to destroy it. They have pursued their own professional dreams and lost out on the greatest female adventure. The women's movement, as we are told time and again, has proved women's own worst enemy. As in the late 80s and early 90s, when women had been cemented within the workforce for a couple of decades, there was no World Wide Web or social media to the masses, so this attitude is reflected in films on career women.
Editing Sylvie here, and I just wanted to clarify the point I'm making. Films in the 80s, particularly those that focused on working women, gave off a vibe that even women who chose to go into professional careers often found themselves pitted against other women and or had to work harder than their male counterparts to only then be often overlooked for promotions. Both the trend of the working women not really having it all in the 80s and the tradwife movement in the 2020s, as reflected in society,
show that only certain women can rise. It pits us against one another instead of there being space for us all. That narrative plays into the age-old way women had to win over a man in order to get married for their self-worth and ultimately their survival. And so much of women's survival comes down to us being feminine and able to bear children. 2025 was also the year AI exploded in discussion and use, and with that, many of the richest people behind its rise speak very clearly about their view on gender roles. So the algorithm feeding us all of these feminine things could also perhaps be trying to tell us what we should be leaning into or away from. In my studies of food history, I have seen how over and over again, women dominated or were expected to own elements of the work they did, whether it was a recognized industry at the time or not. One example is butter being a way for women to profit for their farms in the late 1700s, which I dug into in this butter episode. I think those of us who grew up with the easy ability to open our own bank account, solo travel, buy our own homes without a spouse, that is a beautiful thing. We have the freedom to choose how to spend our time as every single human being on earth should have. In this post-COVID world, it became clear how many women were both working full-time but also expected to teach their children who weren't going to public schools but had to learn from home during the pandemic, and the mental load we are expected to carry without complaint. If I turned up to an event with every facet of my princess cake homemade, no one would cheer on the hours of effort it took whilst slicing into it, even if I had lost sleep or had to sacrifice a meal or two to get it done for that event. In the last couple of years, we've seen a rise in women supporting the idea that feminism is the problem for the male crisis. And if we just go back into our homes, then so many of the world's problems could actually be solved. If we align with the reproductive organs we're born with, the skills we lean into should benefit the systems that have existed throughout humanity, not our own personal strengths that don't necessarily align with those organs. So Princess Cake's rise outside its homeland at this pivotal moment, with its truly feminine shape, name, and layers all covered in a smooth fondant, places a kind of mirror to the world happening around us, leaning into joy. Another element of Princess Cake's rise in 2025 is as simple as how the year began. There was the ushering in of a new US president following a staggering 70 countries holding elections in 2024, with more than half the world's population affected. Add on 393 recorded nature-related disasters in 2024, the obliteration of getting hired thanks to AI in 2025. I personally applied for at least 100 jobs and I only got one interview, as well as the constant increase in prices with no or minimal increase in incomes, and the Princess Cake in her bright colors and party vibes suddenly feels right at home, because what else is there to do when the world is chaos than lean into joy even harder? For Charlotte Zetterstrom, co-founder of the bakery Fabrique, which opened in Stockholm in 2008 and has locations in New York City and London, the Princess Cake is a symbol of celebration and positivity. It's her all-time favorite, she says. The cake is as essential as a Swedish cinnamon bun. Quoting there from the Eater article, the Princess Cake gets its princess moment. And in Christy Sharp's Substack, a season 14 contestant on Great British Bake Off, FYI, Christy declares, there is something so joyful and sweetly nostalgic about this cake. The pastel green marzipan, the pink rose, the softly whipped cream dome. It's beautiful and elegant, but also fun and whimsical. I think we could all use more cakes like this in our lives, not because it's important, but because it's nice, and that's enough of a reason. The first time I opened my Instagram feed to see a post about 2016, I was getting onto a train where I would, within a week or so later, open that same app and watch as a second person was executed in the street by immigration and customs enforcement agents in Minneapolis. 2026 started with mayhem, chaos, crane and train crashes, people hunted from door to door, children killed in the streets by their government, and it becomes apparent why people went looking back 10 years to a different time, one that absolutely no longer exists. It was a completely different world. Even then though, those posts only reflected the hand-picked things of 2016. We probably were all going through some pretty stressful things at that time, but it was still all pre this. In the New York Times article, Why We Reach for Nostalgia in Times of Crisis, things just seemed easier in the before times, and that in times of trauma and overwhelming stress, it's a natural instinct to feel nostalgic and rely on those feelings for comfort and a sense of normalcy, said Valentina Stoicheva, a clinical psychologist specializing in traumatic stress and the author of The Unconscious Theory, Research and Clinical Implications. Nostalgia serves as a kind of emotional pacifier, helping us to become accustomed to a new reality that is jarring, stressful, and traumatic. Quoting there from Valentina again in that same article. Yes, when we feel overwhelmed with life, the state of the world, or both, we reach for things that feel safe and fun. That's probably why we watch the same shows over and over again. I mean, I've lost count how many times I've watched New Girl and Ugly Betty. It just helps me to lean into joyful things and feel so safe regardless of what is happening around me.
I just learned that there is a very good reason we watch the same TV show a million times. Sure, sometimes it is probably laziness, but it's also biology. Rewatching shows, movies, or even playlists creates something called cognitive predictability, which basically means when your brain knows what's coming, it doesn't have to work as hard. Since you already know what's going to happen, your brain feels safe and in control, so it can just relax. But what I think is even cooler is that studies have shown that nostalgia in general, whether it's a treat from your childhood, a comfort book, or even a worn out hoodie, which are basically all of my hoodies, that nostalgia not only triggers lowers dopamine, but can also counteract loneliness, anxiety, and somehow even alleviate some physical pain. So going back to something familiar doesn't mean that you're stuck. Unless it's an ex, don't do that. But actually wanting something nostalgic is just your sweet little brain craving a safe place to relax. So the next time you're craving the rewatch, do it. Your brain is wanting it really badly, which is really sweet. Once again, science is cute.
Amongst all the chaos, we also might return to things we did when we were children. Like last year, I actually tracked down some Lego, purchased it, and played not in my childhood bedroom, but in my own living room. And in that moment where I was building my beloved creation, just like I was 6 again, I didn't think for a second to pick up my phone and look at a screen. Whether it's returning to an old hobby, finally learning that skill we wanted to when we were 5, listening to music from our favorite times, or making and baking things that just make our souls feel calm and restored. There is nothing practical about Princess Cake, but there is a place for it in our world. And so whether we buy it or we make it, we're reminded that things don't have to always have a reason to be worth our time and effort. Christy Sharp sums it up perfectly. The prettiest cake you'll ever make, and yes, it's worth every minute. I personally can't wait to make Princess Cake for absolutely no reason and dig a fork in. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe so that I can continue making videos about our favorite desserts and the world of baking in general. In the meantime, I will see you in the next one. Ka kite anō and tschüss.
I am a princess. All girls are. Even if they live in tiny old attics, even if they dress in rags, even if they aren't pretty or smart or young, they're still princesses. All of us. Didn't your father ever tell you that? Didn't he?